So we wanted to just give a few minutes introduction to the Bell Burnell Society here at college and to Professor Dame Jocelyn Bell Burnell, an outstanding Murray Edwards College alumna who we are honoured to have here speaking today. The Bell Burnell Society is a student-run society, science society at college. We aim to not only share a love of science, but also to emphasize the valuable contributions that women have made in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. In 2022, we renamed and relaunched the society in honor of Dame Jocelyn, inspired by her work and the story behind her discovery, which she made while she was carrying out a PhD research here at Murray Edwards. Jocelyn was the first to notice a series of rapidly pulsating signals on charts produced by the telescope that she helped to build. She insisted that the signals were important and continued to investigate them, leading to the discovery of pulsars, which had so far only been described theoretically. Her lifetime of work empowering women in science also stands out. She has been outspoken about the challenges she has faced as a minority in her field, and even went so far as to donating award money she received for her discovery to help women and underrepresented minorities studying physics.
Despite the progress that has been made in the attitudes towards female scientists since Jocelyn's time as a student, as women scientists ourselves, we've often felt that we needed to work harder than our male peers to gain the same level of respect. In my time at Cambridge, I've witnessed women I admire facing direct adversity in their departments, bias in their career progression, and I know many of my female peers have shared this experience. In renaming our society in honor of Jocelyn Bell Burnell, we hope to inspire the current students and encourage their passion for science looking to the future, while celebrating the significant contributions made by women in STEM here at Murray Edwards throughout the history of the college and ongoing. We believe that it's important for any scientist to be recognized for their work, which is often more difficult for women. And we're extremely proud to have been part of this festival, providing a platform to talk about these barriers and to celebrate some incredible women's achievements. We're very excited to introduce to you Professor Dame Jocelyn Bell Burnell, and we hope you are as inspired by her story as we are. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jocelyn.
So, women in astrophysics. Astrophysics, astronomy, is a branch of physics. It's a branch that actually attracts rather more women than many other branches of physics. So the picture I will give you is a little rosier than the average for physics. But whether you describe it as rosy itself is another issue. Thank you. So I'm going to be talking about UK perspectives. I'm going to be talking exclusively about women in physics, but there are clearly parallels with people of colour, people with disability, other dimensions, but I'm not going to specifically address those. I recognise that the situation is not simply binary, but I'm going to be mainly binary today, I must admit. So, UK culture for science and engineering. If we start near the beginning of life, the next slide, please. These word clouds are the words used to describe toys for boys and toys for girls. You don't need to be told which is which, do you? It starts very, very early, alarmingly so. And it's going to take some very stout parenting of girls to bypass, get around some of those dimensions on the right and move into some of the dimensions on the left. So we are set on a track from when we are about this size. And that's quite something quite formidable to overcome. And so we're lucky you're here. Thank you for being here. Could I have the next slide, please? I've been very conscious, I'm now 80, I've been very conscious of the cultural conditioning of my generation. I hope it is less so for today's students, but I'm sure there's still some of it there. My generation of women were expected to be of service, not to have things in our own right, to be supportive of the men, to be helpful and generous and kind, and never mind our own satisfaction, our own careers, our own success. That's not part of the picture. I went to a girls' boarding school. It blew a bit hot and cold on the education of women and why women were being educated. At one point, the headmistress told us we were being educated to be good wives and mothers. And on another occasion, she told us we were being educated that we might fulfill our potential. And she apparently saw no conflict between those two statements. And I don't think she was stupid. I think that's where society was. This was the 1950s, 1960s. And while generations of women older than me did not expect to have careers, subsequent generations do. Thank goodness. But my particular generation and the years close to me were kind of around that turning point. Are women expected to have careers, or are they expected to marry, become wives and mothers, and carry out a supportive role at home? Could I have the next slide, please? I'm a physicist, actually an astrophysicist, but my home department in a university has always been physics. And as some of you will know from personal experience, there aren't that many women in physics. It's getting better. But when I was a young scientist in a physics department, I could be the only female in the place. At least the only female above PhD, probably the only female above bachelor's level. And there were some interesting consequences. They wanted to show the first year class that there were some women in the department. So they gave that woman the job of lecturing to the first year class. Now, it's a great privilege to lecture to first years, but you have the largest class in the department, with the largest load of marking, with the largest load of people with problems, with the largest load of examining. And at that stage, departments didn't take note of how big your lecturing load was. You just did what you were asked to do. So I lectured to the first year class. I can remember introducing questionnaires for the students to complete. How did you find the course? How did you find the lecturing? What I also remember is some of the students saying, is Professor so-and-so going to hand out these questionnaires? I say, I don't know, but I doubt it. That's a pity. So on open days, you're on show. On the website, you're on show. If the department has a diversity committee, of course you're on it. And you serve as an unofficial tutor to female students, which is fine. I have no issue with that. But it would be better if it was recognized. You're also in the department serving as an advocate for more women, kind of uphill that. And on interview panels, we want to show that the department has some women, even if it's only a woman. And you do a lot of extra work. It turned out recently in the engineering department in Oxford, where I'm now based, that there aren't many women. And the few women that there were being asked to sit on lots and lots of interview panels. They went on strike. And the department had to train up some of the postdoc females to sit on interview panels. Great! Fantastic experience for postdocs, sitting alongside the professor who's never spoken to them or acknowledged their existence, and having an almost equal voice on an interview panel. But interesting ramifications of where we've been, and I'm sure that some of the other senior women in the room will have had similar experiences. To the next slide, please. So as you will have gathered, there's a shortage of women in senior positions in some areas. And maybe it's because there's too few entering, maybe it's because there's too few leaving, maybe it's because they advance too slowly, and I think it's probably a bit of all of those. And the next slide, thank you. Good management. Talking about management of an academic department in Cambridge. Do it naturally, don't we? And do it bloody awful, some of you too. Good management benefits everybody in a department, but it particularly advantages those who are in a minority. The women, the people of colour, other minority groups like that. Bad management affects everybody, but it seems to hurt the minority groups more than it hurts the majority. And there is some evidence, incidentally, that poor physics teaching disadvantages girl students more than boy students. I don't know if there's been follow-up work on that, but it wouldn't be totally surprising, I think. Thank you. So, where have we been in the UK? How have we got here? It's quite an interesting track. Could I have the next slide, please? So you start by collecting data. How many women and men are there at each level in a department? And surprise, surprise, in science and engineering departments, it shows the women are in a minority. Admittedly, the minority gets smaller the higher the level. There's more at the younger junior levels. So maybe they'll filter through. Maybe they won't, but maybe. But it also shows that the women advance up the ranks more slowly than their male counterparts. And it shows that women put in fewer grant applications, they're less willing to apply for jobs, they're less often asked to be the keynote speakers at conferences. There's just a slight disadvantage in every dimension. The next slide, please. So the first solution to this was fix the women. Make the women braver. Help the women do better applications. Help the women do more applications. Of course, obviously, that's the way to do it, isn't it? In fact, they even had special training courses for a while for women to make them braver and better. But that assumed the problem was with the women, and that the shortage of women was simply due to the women and not a symptom of anything else, which I think has been shown to be a false assumption, besides being extremely patronizing. The next slide, please. So they created special funding for women, returner fellowships for women who were coming back after maternity leave, or maybe after several sets of maternity leave and starting a family. And possibly there was the possibility of other things open to women only. It turned out, however, that some charming gentlemen would say to these women on returner roles, "You only got that role because you're a woman. You're pulling down the standard of the department. You should leave." That has actually happened. That is as precise a quote as I can remember from the woman who told me the story. So increasingly, these types of funding are open to both men and women. Men who've taken a career break to help look after a baby, for instance. And that is much healthier, although I think still it's women who do that kind of thing more often. And the next slide, please. And then funding agencies began to recognize that giving funding to individual women was great in that it helped those women, but it was sufficiently small that it wasn't actually changing academic society, the ethos in departments. And they began a rethink. And they began to look for what is known as institutional change. The ethos in a department, the way it's run, that kind of thing, or the ethos in a university and the way it is run. So making the place fairer for everybody, not just the women. And the next slide, please. Many programs assume that women are lacking something. Women are deficient in some way compared with men. And these programs were to decrease the deficiency, make women as good as men, behaving the same way, God help us. And the feeling was it was the women who need to change. Men, we're fine. The way we run things, brilliant. Women need to be more like men. But first of all, there's a question, why should women do all the changing? Well, I have to admit, in science and engineering, they are in a minority, and it's sometimes a bit hard to get the majority to change. But even so, it would be great if science and the culture in science and engineering departments would move towards women, as well as, if you like, women moving towards men. But there began to be recognition that longer term, the climate in science and engineering departments in some, many, all, don't know, British universities needed to change. The next slide, please. So, institutional change. We're not talking about individuals who are discriminating. They can be dealt with. We're talking about university systems and structures that inadvertently often are discriminating. Institutional sexism, for example. Possible biases in recruitment or retention. And one of my particular beefs is no awareness of different management styles. The strong male manager was what everybody should be. And one of the things that's surprisingly prevalent is what we call unconscious bias. Got an example down there at the bottom of the slide. Do you see anything wrong with that? Well, there's only two. These days we'd have more boxes, including one that might say, prefer not to say. Why does M come before F? It's not alphabetical order. That is unconscious bias. And you still find it today in many, many documents. So let me suggest to you a little ploy. You receive a document, maybe from a university, maybe from your professional body, asking you, for instance, about how is life in your subject, in your department. And there's lots and lots of questions. You know, is the management of your place good? Do you enjoy your work? Are you able to progress? Blah, 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 blah. And then there's another one that says M or F. Maybe they allow some more. If you come across M before F, send the questionnaire back saying, I'm not able to fill this in because you're showing unconscious bias. Wait a day or two, and back will come an email to you from the organisers of the questionnaire. We're very, very keen not to show unconscious bias. We've looked terribly hard at our questionnaire. We can't see it. Please, would you tell us where the unconscious bias is? And you point them to that. This is the kind of subtle message that women are up against the whole time. And it is still happening, in spite of me sending back many questionnaires. Please join the campaign. Thank you. Similar issues in business. Can I have the next slide, please? A management company called McKinsey's has done quite a lot of work on women and how women are advancing in a business environment. Looking at companies, looking at the diversity of the senior management, looking at the diversity of their boards. And they find that ones that are more diverse are more robust, more flexible, and more successful than companies that are less diverse. If that applies to companies, it's plausible, isn't it, that it also applies to university departments, university management? Diversity makes a difference to the success of an organization. It's not just about fairness to women or whatever minority group we're talking about. It's to do with the success of the whole organization. Diversity matters. Can I have the next slide, please? To some extent, the success of women in an organization is a bit like the canaries they used to take down coal mines. Before they had sensors of bad air, of dangerous gases, miners took a canary in a cage down with them. And if the canary keeled over, they knew the air was bad and they had to get out quick. Canaries being more sensitive than the average miner. To some extent, the number of women in a place, or the number of minorities in a place, is a bit like the canary. If they're very, very few, there's probably an issue. If there are plenty, congratulations. Next slide, please. So, I'm an astronomer, an astrophysicist, if I want to be more scary, and I belong to Royal Astronomical Society. I actually also belong to the American one, but there is a global body for astronomers. It's called the International Astronomical Union. And if you're an astronomer, you can be a member of it. You just need to get your country's astronomy society to forward your name. And in case anybody's taking this seriously, our body is called the Royal Astronomical Society. So the Royal Astronomical Society will forward your name to the International Astronomical Union, and because you work in Britain, you're registered as a Brit, United Kingdom. The IAU has kept the data on its individual membership, the membership of individuals in it, for a good many years. And I've been tracking the data by country, the country where you work, actually, not your nationality, tracking the data by country for a good many years. And it makes interesting data. This is 2023. I've focused on countries that have more than 200 members so that the root N error is not too large. And I have listed them here by the percentage of their membership that is female. The world average is 22%, which is not brilliant. Italy, high, 30% of its membership is female. France, nearly as good. Australia, quite high. Spain, high. Brazil, high. Russia always has had a lot of women working, because during the Second World War, they lost a lot of men. The women had to go out to work. The state had to provide nurseries. And so in the USSR, women have worked for a long time. See the UK there? Not doing very well. USA, Canada, also English-speaking, bits below the world average. Interestingly, Southern European countries do very well. South America tends to do quite well. The northern countries in Europe, the northern countries in the US, in America, don't do so well. A lot of this must be culture. It's not that women's brains are different in these parts of the world, are they? It's something to do with the way they've been educated and what they've been brought up to expect. But it's a bit depressing overall. And in terms of physics, astrophysics is one of the few branches of physics that has the largest fraction of women. Large, relatively. Can I have the next slide? Thank you. This is going back, this is June 2020. Italy still high, Spain still high, so Southern Europe, Southern America, Russia still high. English-speaking countries not doing very well. UK doing abominably, again. Japan's worse, but big deal that. So, yep, and the next slide, please. Suddenly, the IAU has recognized that two categories of male and female aren't adequate. So they've suddenly gone non-binary. If the next slide, please. I'm not going to be able to do this analysis anymore. But how many issues do you see with that list? Is it in alphabetical order? Why not? It is now because I yelled at them. But for God's sake, it shouldn't take women to say, you know, play it straight. But sometimes apparently you have to. It also means I'm not going to be able to do this analysis any longer because there's so many different options now. But never mind, I think I've made the point. And the next slide, please. Sorry, I've said that. Next slide, please. So my main message is that I think good management benefits everybody, but it particularly benefits women. Conversely, bad management is bad for everybody, but it's particularly bad for women, and probably other minorities as well. And a related issue, I think poor physics teaching at school seems to affect the girls more than it affects the boys, which is a little bit sad. And the next slide, please. Thank you very much for your interest and your attention. I hope you found that useful. And look out for unconscious bias. Challenge it, please. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you so, so much for that, Jocelyn. That was absolutely incredible, and I'm sure resonated with a lot of people here today. I'd quite like to start with a question. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that when you were at school, obviously it was quite a while ago in a different culture, but you were told quite directly that your education was to be a wife and a mother.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering how you challenged that to have the confidence to know that you wanted to go into physics and you wanted to get the further education and you wanted to stay in academia. And as a related question, not that it's as overt for us, but how do you think we can approach that?
Yeah. I was lucky in that my parents were very, very supportive and encouraging. And I think my father had already sussed out that I was quite scientifically, mathematically inclined. So I had great support there. The school's attitude kept changing. I think they really didn't know what they were educating girls for. So I could hang on to the bits where they didn't say we were just meant to be good wives and mothers, but we were meant to have careers and change the world. Yeah. But it has been uphill. I've been lucky in that I found a subject that I loved, and I'm going to do it. Never mind the world, I'm going to do it.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, and I think being in something that you are genuinely passionate about really can drive that confidence. Adele?
Yeah, you talk about implicit bias. Do you have examples of how it's personally affected you and you've noticed? Because we sometimes don't notice it, but is there anything you can think of that you've been like, this is not right?
There's some pretty shocking examples. As a physics undergraduate, actually they called it natural philosophy, but it's physics. As a physics undergraduate, I was the only female in the class, 49 men and me. And Glasgow was quite rough at that time, may still be for all I know. And it was the, quote, tradition, at least in science and engineering, that when a woman entered the lecture theatre, all the guys whistled, stamped, generally made as much embarrassing noise as they could. And if you blushed, they made a lot more noise. And that was the norm. The lecturers didn't join in, but one or two of them looked as if they wished they could, you know, a sort of sly smile. So it was uncomfortable, unkind, but it was, quote, the norm at that place at that time. So watch the norms.
It's really appalling that no one stepped in to prevent this. I think, should we open to the
Yeah,
audience?
does anyone have a question from the... Oh, that's
Okay, right.
We've got a roaming mic.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation, and it's so good to see you back in the college. I've got a question. What do you think makes astronomy and astrophysics so attractive to women? Is it because it's magical and glittery and aligns with the description of the toys we're getting? Like, what's your theory?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that. Obviously, glorious pictures help. And if you stop to think about the size and the scale of whatever you're looking at in these astronomical photographs, it's really awe-inspiring. But I don't actually know quite why it hooked me so much. It definitely hooked me first, and then I discovered that there were more women in astro than there are in most other branches of physics. It wasn't that was the cause. So I don't know. Maybe just the scale appealed.
Next.
You touched upon the schemes that are aimed primarily to women and the danger that we run if we are recruited through such a scheme, that men then will say that you are not as good as us. So what is the way forward strategically? Should we have more of those returner schemes or other female-friendly schemes, or what's the way to balance this out and reduce that risk of, enhancing the imposter syndrome even more?
One of the things I'm involved with through the Institute of Physics, which is our professional body, is there is a scheme to give grants to potential PhD students who are from minorities in physics groups. So minorities in physics obviously means women, but it also means people of colour, people with disabilities. And the Institute of Physics has been running that scheme now for several years. And it's not going to make a huge difference, but they fund something like 10 or a dozen students each year at different universities all around the country. And that at least means at the PhD level that the PhD body is that little bit more diverse. Now, that doesn't mean they stay on into academia and become physics professors, but some of them will. So I think if we can increase the representation of underrepresented groups at the more junior levels in physics, and as far as possible help them to stay in the field, that's what will make the difference long term. But it's a long-term program.
Thank you. Do keep putting your hands up, because I think we're just working from the back to the front, so we will reach you.
You've mentioned management and how it affects women more than men, and how good management helps women a lot more than it helps men. Do you think that would still be prevalent if there wasn't sexism? Do you think it's a case of almost taking the brakes off, and because women have already had to work harder, when the management evens the playing field, they're then able to progress further and benefit more from that? Or do you think it's just something that happens? So sort of, is it the culture we've been raised in, or is it some difference?
I think a lot of it is the culture we've been raised in, but the more female and minority representation you get in a department, the more evenly the population of the department is, I think the better the ambience. Although an awful lot depends on the head of department and how they run it. And I don't know many physics professors that have asked for training in management. So some people can do it. A lot of people would benefit from some training and won't take it.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your presentation, and I'm pleased to say that Glasgow has changed somewhat since.
Good.
I just wanted to ask about, you mentioned when you're in school the kind of contradiction between we are educating you to become wives and mothers, but we're also educating you to fulfill your potential. I wonder what you think about the possibility of if that had been framed differently, and they had said something like, we want to provide you and support you to have the skills to navigate a world in which you may wish to become mothers and fulfill your potential, because the two should not be mutually exclusive.
Yeah, I like that very much. But what the head teacher was saying was actually for consumption by the parents, particularly the fathers, who are paying our school fees. And your version is fantastic, but probably wouldn't cut much ice with a father.
You talked about the importance of good management. I wondered if you had any particular positive examples of good management that you could share.
I'm sure I have. I haven't sort of thought about that one, I must admit. I think in general it's getting better in universities. I can't really speak for outside universities. I think, for instance, the top management, vice-chancellors and the like, are more alert to these kinds of issues. And the very bolshy physicist, I'm a physicist, leave me alone kind of approach would be less acceptable these days because of changes at the top.
How did you make your voice heard when in like such a male-dominated field, specifically when you were doing your research into pulsars?
I probably should have made more noise. This was in Cambridge. This is Cambridge in the 1960s. This college has just started. The fellows are extremely anxious that we, the students, behave perfectly. Huge pressure on us, because they were afraid if we misbehaved, some of the senior males would say, trust a woman, no more women. And that would be the end of women's colleges, or more women's colleges, bigger women's colleges. So I still very clearly remember that first briefing. Students, do you remember where you go and you collect your O and A level certificates back from the college, and the senior tutor lays into you about how important it is you behave? Definitely huge anxiety at that stage. And in physics, there were very, very few women. I think I was the only female grad student in the whole time I was in my research group. There had been one or two women at postdoc level. When I arrived, they left quite soon after I arrived. There were some female secretaries. You're very much on your own navigating. And I felt it particularly important to make sure that I wasn't playing the sex card. That, I think, is perhaps the most important thing. Never mind your brain. I mean, it's sex that matters, or it doesn't matter. Yeah.
Hi. I guess I wanted to ask, as a woman in academia yourself, why is it that you think young women such as myself, we're constantly being pushed towards, in these sort of career talks and thinking about our future, we're being pushed towards academia in terms of primary school teaching or teaching young children in secondary school instead of any form of, teaching at universities and stuff? Do you think that is just because women are so slow to climb the ranks, or do you think it's because of just colleges have no want for female professors and such?
Right. I hadn't realised that the career options offered you were exactly the same as the career options offered me 50 years ago. That is disturbing, and I hope the college hears, and the rest of the university. There should be much wider options, because between you, your group of students has a range of talents. And some of you be bloody awful teachers. Should not go into teaching. Other strengths, but you know.
I think I'm the same generation as Jocelyn, and I had the same experiences.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things, we did some statistics in our generation a bit later, and it was very striking that my father was also, like yours, very firmly a feminist.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that was very striking in our generation, at least, was that by and large, there were very few women who had brothers. And therefore, there was some sense that fathers who would have pushed their sons as, you know, the person that they were pushing on, suddenly were pushing their daughters to do and to achieve.
Yeah.
And I think in our generation, we had all that same incredible prejudice. And, you know, I was also the only woman in every class I ever attended, everything I did. But there were always some men of power who were very, very positive and pushed us. And I think that is something that's very striking. I'm not sure about Jocelyn, but I know that I would have not achieved what I did. I wouldn't have gone on. I wouldn't have been as confident to do the PhD, to apply for the postdoc I did when I was the only woman that got a NATO fellowship that year in the world in physics and maths, if the men hadn't, some of the men who believed in me hadn't pushed me. And so I think that before we talk about only the men being negative, there have been a lot of men who, for whatever reason, whether they had no sons, but there were men who believed that we should do things. And I think that it's very complex. And the social things, as Jocelyn pointed out, are very important. I always preferred giving colloquia in France or in Italy when I was traveling the world. Jocelyn's nodding her head, because the reaction of the audience was so much more positive. And it's not surprising that when you look at the statistics that there are more women in France and in Italy, because the men in France and Italy are more receptive, are more welcoming. You got better questions from the Latin men, more respectful questions. And interestingly, also in India, which is way ahead of us in terms of participation of women at the moment. They're way ahead of us. So it's interesting. Culture is very...
Thank you for that. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. You've obviously had a very long career with lots of experience, but have you ever felt moments of weakness throughout your career? And if you have, what has helped you power through it, whether that's internally, like your mindset, or externally, so your friends, your family, peers and teachers, the such?
I had my secondary education in England and then went to university in Scotland. And there was quite a mismatch between the English education system, school education system, and the Scottish school education system. And the Scottish degrees, particularly the first years, matched onto the Scottish education system. And I had quite a bit of trouble in that I had to do a range of subjects in first year university, having only done maths and physics to A level in an English school. So, for instance, I really struggled in chemistry to begin with. I was at a girls' boarding school, and we had quite some trouble getting good science teachers. And our chemistry teacher was particularly bad. I remember us pointing to a periodic table up on the wall behind us and said, you know, why is that the way it is? And the chemistry teacher, who should have told us about atomic structure, said, God made it so. So I was very, very weak in chemistry and had a huge struggle to catch up. Borrowed some books from a slightly older young man that I knew who was also doing science at another university, and taught myself a lot of chemistry over the first Christmas vacation, for example. It was quite hard, but if I wanted to get a degree, which I did, I had to pass that first year chemistry. That was part of the rules of that university. So that was really a very depressing and tough time, but I made it through, and having made it through, that increases your confidence. You know, I managed first year university chemistry from a really grotty O-level. So you work hard, you pitch in, and your achievements actually help build your confidence, I think. In terms of a massive university like Glasgow, you don't have tutors or things like that. There's nobody looking out for you. It's you.
Thank you.
Thank you for inspiring us. It really is incredibly inspiring to hear you talk, and so personally. I think we mustn't overlook the point you made right at the beginning about the influences on small children and babies. And I know the discussion has moved somewhat away from that, and perhaps we'll have time to cover more of it as the festival progresses. But we mustn't lose that. That is an absolutely crucial point. And the other point you've made, which I think we're beginning to develop in this discussion, which I think is really important, is this whole issue about good management. Because I don't have an academic career background, but I have worked for the last 40 years in commercial publishing and in the commercial sector. And I absolutely know that good management makes a massive difference, not only to the performance of the organisation in terms of its output and its success, but also in terms of its ability to engage the talent that is available to it. And as soon as you've got switched on management that really can create a culture that embraces the potential for everyone to contribute, you're onto a good thing. It absolutely is, to use that dreadful cliche, a win-win situation. So I think if university departments still feel they're struggling with this, then management has to be at the top. Management and its culture has to be at the top of every agenda for strategy, planning and development work that those organisations embrace, because it really makes a massive difference. And I know we talk about it in a sort of general way, but there are disciplines around it. There are ways of training and engaging management skills. There are ways of growing management skills. There are ways of respecting and valuing them in the organisation. And that absolutely has to happen if women are to progress in any organisation.
Please keep saying that in academic environments. Thank you very much. That's really heartening.
You've talked about harassment within a university situation and throughout your career. How often has that manifested as sexual harassment, and how have you worked through any kind of harassment to get past it and continue with what you're doing? Is there any other way than just brute forcing your way through it?
I think the way Glasgow University students greeted females had a large sexual component. It was important not to blush. If you blushed, they just made more noise. They were winning, so to speak. That was probably the main time. There's been the odd occasion at work where a gentleman has got a little bit close and feely, but usually I was able to kind of back away a bit, and mostly they understood what I was saying when I backed away. So overt sexual harassment is there, but hasn't been too great an issue for me. I think probably what was more of an issue was pressure to get married. If you don't get married, what's wrong with you? You're lesbian or something like that. I mean, this is 1960s we're talking. So I think I was more aware of that than actually, being groped, so to speak. Maybe I've just been lucky, I'm not sure. But.
Thanks very much for that, Jocelyn. A question a point that you raised earlier, and that was on support at an early stage from parents, from teachers, or from others. I remember talking to fellow physics students in my final year, the women students, and we all had either parents who were scientists or engineers, or very supportive teachers, or some very strong role model. And I wondered if, in looking through statistics, this is still the case, that the women rely very much on role models.
I don't know of statistics that would answer that question. I strongly suspect that role models, supportive parents, are a great help. But I don't know. Do you know, Athene, data on this?
There was a study which showed the X-Files had been enormously important because there was a strong female scientist.
Yes.
But I've struggled to find much about role models, certainly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hi. I wondered if I could ask you about the international astronomy data that you produced before. And just wondering whether, as a result of, say, Italy having the highest membership, 31%, and Japan having the lowest, is there anything that characterises the science that therefore emerges from those different places that sort of indicates what female participation actually produces?
I'm not sure that I would attribute any difference to female participation specifically, but you can attribute it to cultural attitudes. Japan is very well organized, neat, tidy, effective organization, with probably in a room of this size, one woman if you're lucky. Italy, again, true to probably the caricature, slightly less well organized, a bit more free for all, some fantastic creativity as a result. Maybe also a certain amount of wastage as a result. And you wouldn't get wastage in Japan. It's too well controlled. But I don't see the quantity of women feeding into that. I think it's those attitudes that show in the fraction of females.
Sorry, another voice from the past. I came to Newhall in 1965 and then read about you. I was amazed. I hadn't realised what wonderful things were going on as I messed about in all sorts of ways. Just to tell the younger people here, some of the things that have been said, very, very true. There were so few women. I was under pursuit. It was absolutely terrifying. If somebody took you out and you didn't particularly like him, and he asked you again and you said, no, thank you, in the nicest way you could, they got really angry because they thought they'd found a girlfriend because there were so few women. I'm not funny, it's not funny.
Yeah.
And the pressure for marriage was really an expectation.
Yes.
And somebody I'd fallen in love with asked me to marry him, and I married him my second year. Believe that? One or two other people did. And stayed on and finished my degree and taught in a school, taught science and biology particularly, and started a family a few years later. And that marriage actually didn't last, but I married again. But just to tell you, give you hope over the generations, I am a granny of 13. I was a teacher in various schools and then in very academic girls' schools because I got subsidies for my older 3 children there. And then I became a head teacher. I applied from the classroom floor. You don't have to always go up the way people think. You just go for what you think you can do and don't mind failing. Who cares about that? And I became a head teacher in a girls' academic school. And it was a real pleasure to encourage the science, to encourage the young teachers. And don't even think you have to stay in the same career if If you want to be an academic, university teacher and professor, you can do it, but you may not do it quite the way that some people do if you're also having a family. But the most exciting thing is, of my 5 children, I have seen my daughters marry people who will share the work with the children. And the last one, I've got 4 daughters and a son. The son shares everything because he's got 4 older sisters, he knows about that. And the youngest daughter has a husband who really wants to be part-time, as she is, in their jobs and looking after their child. And you can do it. You can have your careers. Don't ever, ever think you can't do what you want to do. You can. You can have it all, but rather slowly.
Thank you.
Hello, Jocelyn. Thank you for your interesting thoughts, of which I recognise quite a lot. I was here at Newhall 20 years later, roughly, and did natural sciences. I specialised in geology and geophysics, and in that time, in '82, there were very few jobs open to women in that sphere.
Yes.
I went and did some different things for a while, and then after a couple of years, I joined the Royal Navy, initially teaching engineers science and maths, and then I went into meteorology, oceanography, and, as everybody tends to do in that sphere, management later on in those areas.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I was there by their necessity, because they opened the jobs to women when I joined, which was great. But I found that when I proved myself, which luckily I could, doors opened very, very readily. And I had a great career. And rather like the lady over there, we did have management who recognised talent and potential. And there were a lot of opportunities. So I'd like to add a note of optimism. I mean, I haven't had a great deal of experience of academia since university, but in that particular walk of life, I was very lucky. And I then went on and did other things after that. But just you know, if you fancy joining the Royal Navy, from my experience, it was very good.
Thank you.
You have highlighted how poor management can exacerbate existing inequalities. What are your tips for challenging poor management, or more broadly, poor policy in both academia and just organisations in general?
That's quite hard if you are in a minority. You really need to get some males, powerful males, on your side and saying the same thing. If you're working somewhere like a physics department where you're in quite a small minority. We're lucky in the Oxford Physics Department. We've got very good management at the moment, and very good management of our sub-department by somebody who was a grad student of mine, which is great. So good management makes a huge difference to a place. Probably more for the women than for the men, but it does make a huge difference. I still think it's in academia, it's not recognized for what it is, good management. It's my hunch. I don't know whether academics in the room would agree with that, but I think in academia there's still, oh, you can manage, you can run a department, of course you can, you're intelligent. You're a physicist, you're very intelligent, you can.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. I was just wondering, we've been discussing recently how it's like very clear that as more women have like progressed into fields like biology and psychology, that they become labelled as like an easy or soft science. And I think I would argue it's also now kind of happening, especially in Cambridge, with like earth sciences becoming, or geology becoming like the easier option of physics. And I was wondering if you think, as more women have progressed into like physics and maths, whether you've noticed that kind of narrative, or whether you think it will occur in the future as it becomes, as hopefully more women progress into it, or do you think that it's kind of like inherently different in that way? That makes sense.
Yeah, I'm not sure, to be honest. I think I've not got enough experience of the variety of things. I do have a geology story, however. at Glasgow University, you had to do a range of subjects. And I opted to do first-year geology as one of my subjects because it fitted the timetable. I thought it might be interesting. It was fantastic. I came top of the class, the first-year class, without trying, whereas physics was a real grind, and I thought, maybe I should be a bit geologist, not an astronomer. And went to see the professor who was head of geology about changing to honours geology, and he said, no, not for women. At that point, most geologists were employed exploring for oil in Burma, in the jungle. And of course, there's no ladies' toilets in the jungle in Burma, so women can't be geologists.
I think we may only have time for one last question.
Got one.
Yeah. I'd like to add one to that. I was a research student in astronomy here in Cambridge, but needing a job at one point, I went to work for the British Antarctic Survey in Cambridge, and I had I think my job was called Head of Information, and it involved doing the publications and so on. Very interesting and a privilege to work there. And after about 4 or 5 years, I decided it was time to move on, and I went to see the director, and he said, "Oh, it's a pity you're going to leave now. We're just thinking of letting women go." And this was, 1986. The whole time I'd been there in the 1980s, it was still men only.
Yeah.
Again, I think it was very much, well, we don't have the facilities.
Yeah.
You know, shades of the days when Vera Rubin, the famous pioneering woman astronomer, went to Palomar Observatory and stuck a skirted woman's picture over the men's picture on the toilets. And very much the same kind of thing.
Mm. Yeah. We have a lot of stories in the room, haven't we?
Fantastic. Thanks.
I thought I should just introduce myself as being an alumna of New Hall from 1955.
Yeah.
And I was the first to ever do Part 2 physics. And I first worked in X-ray crystallography. And then, having had too many X-rays, I moved to radio astronomy.
Yes.
But what saved me was my parents both taught English, so I didn't have any background from my parents, but I could always do maths. Mm-hmm. And I more or less taught myself the maths at school. And what saved me in progressing was the fact that early computers were just beginning.
Yeah.
And there were enormous computers in Cambridge, of course, all valves. Yes. And women did a lot of computing in those days. This is another subject which is quite interesting to explore. Yes. And the radio astronomy at that time, in order to use Martin Ryle's new ideas in radio astronomy, desperately needed computer programmers.
Yeah.
And I found I was intrigued by the computer, and I found it was something I could do. And so, in spite of having 2 children, I managed to keep my foot in the door, because whenever I worked, to start with, I worked completely freelance. Whenever I said, "Can I come back?" "Oh, yes, we want you to do this." And Martin Ryle would come into my office and draw in 3 colours of chalk on the blackboard and says, "This is what we want the telescopes to do in real time," and so on. And so I worked in the Cavendish for nigh on 50 years, and eventually got more into the radio astronomy. And by submitting the papers of which I was the first author, I did gain a PhD at the age of 70.
Hey!
I wonder if I just may ask one last question, since I work here, to hijack the last question. Jocelyn, you're the discoverer of pulsars, as our sign says, but the Nobel Prize for that discovery didn't go to you. We have a lot of young people from local sixth form colleges in the audience. They just might want to know a little about that story and hear about your reflections on not being awarded that prize at the time.
Okay, how many hours do we have?
Briefly. I'm sorry. Give us the 2-minute version and then we can hit the coffee break.
Yeah. I and my supervisor were involved in the discovery of a new kind of star called a pulsar. I was actually the grad student that analysed the data that says, hey, there's something different, peculiar here. A few years later, the Nobel Prize for Physics went to my supervisor and another radio astronomer, Martin Ryle. And my colleagues referred to the Nobel Prize as the No-Bell Prize, because my maiden name was Bell. So it sort of instantly became a slightly notorious case. I was actually really pleased about the award because until then, the physics committee of the Nobel outfit, the people that decided who got the physics prize, they had never given a prize in astronomy, astrophysics. They hadn't recognized the physics in astronomy. And this was the first time they had. And I knew that was really, really important. And I knew that other astrophysicists would get that Nobel Prize, that physics prize. And that certainly proved to be true. You can actually do quite well out of not getting a Nobel Prize. Be warned, if you get a Nobel Prize, you have a fantastic trip to Stockholm one December, and that's it. You never get any other prize, because no other prize committee feels they can match the Nobel. If you don't get a Nobel Prize, you get every other prize that exists.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all of that. I'd like to thank everyone for their questions and particularly everyone who's shared some of their stories. That was really inspiring to hear from you all, so thank you very much. And I think we're ready to go for coffee. So thanks again, Jocelyn, for speaking to us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.